What's up, friends? Welcome to SPDM TV. My name is Mike, part of the SPDM crew, and I watch a lot of TV. We talk about various TV topics, reviews, and general appreciation of TV, past and new. You can follow me on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Serialized at MLHT2452 to see what all I'm watching. So, way back when, and by way back when, I mean a couple of years ago, it's not like it's that long. I used to write for a website where they gave me the opportunity to podcast. And what I did was that I'm taking a look at some of these episodes that I did before and looking to see if I can kind of introduce them to a new audience. So I am going to do a series where I release some of those episodes just so that I can showcase just some of the past work that I've done. So this first one that I'm going to be releasing, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, celebrated an anniversary not too long ago. And I had my friend Iris Wilson-Farley on to talk about her experiences with Buffy the Vampire Slayer and why it's important. We recorded it a while ago, but I recently recorded with her to talk about opera. So one thing that had happened between now and then, because we talked a lot about the Josh Whedon situation. One thing that we talked about was we talked about the death of Michelle Trachtenberg, and so that's on there as well. So we'll do the intro for that, and then the episode proper. And thank you very much for listening. Hey there, everyone. We are going to rebroadcast actually an episode where we talked about Buffy the Vampire Slayer and where Iris, who I have on here with me, we talked about Buffy the Vampire Slayer because she is a huge Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan. But we're going to be rebroadcasting that because this week we did learn of the passing of a cast member from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Michelle Trachtenberg died at the age of 39. Iris, you're more familiar with the show than I am. And so kind of describe who Michelle was in the context of the show and what her passing kind of has done for you as a Buffy fan. Or
Yeah,
just a person in
it
general too.
was. I would say first off, news came through the other day, and it's shocking and sad whenever you see somebody with a lot of talent die at 39. So it was a surprise, obviously, and a sad surprise. I think Dawn Michelle Trachtenberg, in the context of the show, played Dawn, who was Buffy's younger sister. It was kind of a weird surprise because for the first few seasons, Buffy didn't have a sister, and all of a sudden she had a sister magically appear, and so it was a bit of a mystery for several episodes. Over time, she came to accept this being as her sister. I would say in some ways, in the character of Dawn, Michelle Trachtenberg kind of had a rough go. She wasn't a character that was beloved by the fans for a long time. I think she maybe does better in retrospect, but she was sort of the whiny younger sister for a long time. Then she was a bit of an object to move the plot along. I would say that once you get out of season 5 and into seasons 6 and 7, you start to see Dawn take on more character, frankly. Offset, when we did the podcast, we talked a little about some of the controversy that was going on around Joss Whedon. Michelle Trachtenberg came up in some of those conversations because famously the cast and crew knew that she was not to be ever in a situation where she was one-on-one with Joss Whedon. That's about as much as we know, but the inferences aren't great.
Nope.
And I mean, James Marsters, who I loved in his role of as Spike, he also had a bit of a singer-songwriter career. Wrote a song called Dangerous that in more than once he's said that song was about Michelle Trachtenberg. And the basic gist of that song is it's dangerous for me to be around you because you're young and I shouldn't be thinking what I'm thinking. So it's difficult. It's difficult for me to think about Michelle Trachtenberg. I think she's one of those celebrity stories where the person had a rougher time than what we saw on screen. And, you hear snippets and bits and pieces of that. But I certainly wish her family well and whatever measure of peace they can find over time in the wake of her passing. But I also think it's a great time and a great idea, Mike, to go back and revisit the discussion around Buffy, because I think over time she got her due as a character, but it took a while. It took a while, and there were a whole group of fans that even after the series had ended, were very quick to say "Shut up, Dawn." And over time, I think people tried to kind of say, "No, no, no, let's cut the kids some slack." So,
Well, and you're seeing that a lot where TV and movies there's performance choices and there's things that are just beyond the actor's control that just they don't ingratiate with their fans the way that they hope, and then all like years later people look back and be like, okay, this wasn't the dog shit that I was making it out to be when I was younger and stupider and not giving people the benefit of the doubt the way that we should, which is ridiculous, but
sure.
that's just how fandom works sometimes. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's sad because Michelle Trachtenberg, for me, knew her from Harriet the Spy, knew her from her Legend or not Legends, Adventures of Pete and Pete days, and even going into her adult years when she was in Eurotrip as well. So you're right, incredibly sad at 39 because I'm 39 now.
Mm,
And knowing that she struggled as much as she did, she also, I don't think that they've kind of like done their investigation yet as to what happened, but it still doesn't change the fact that it's sad and we just wish her well. And you're right, it is a good time to just review that conversation about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So we'll go ahead and play that now.
cool.
M. Hilty his. So, as I mentioned before, I do have a guest. My good friend Iris is here to talk with me about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Iris, what's up?
Hey, Mike. Gosh, it's good to be here. What's up? Just hanging out on a Thursday night, just looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. So, Iris and I have known each other a long time. We grew up in the same, or grew up, I guess. We were part of the same church for a long time. Iris has known me for well over half my life. So Iris stood in my wedding, so we've known each
Yeah,
other a long time. And in March, a show that celebrated an anniversary was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And instantly, the first person I thought of when I think of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the show, is Iris. And the reason why is because she knows she, ever since I've known her, she has loved the show. Like since I was in high school, she's just known it so well. So, can you tell me what was it about Buffy the Vampire Slayer that kind of hooked you?
sure. Can I make a quick pronoun note before
Yes,
we go too far? Just
absolutely.
because it may throw people off a little bit to hear Mike referring to me as she and to hear my voice. I am a trans woman, and for those that don't know, for those that transition from male to female, especially late in life, getting your voice more feminine sounding is a bit of an ongoing performance that I have not mastered yet. So if I sound a little deeper, that would be why. But just for what it's worth, when you hear Mike refer to me as Iris and she and all of that, he's right. And if you think my voice is a bit low, you're right. Two things can be true. So what first drew me to Buffy? Billboards, actually. I remember seeing a billboard on my commute that back when it first came on the air. So just when season one of Buffy was starting to roll out, it was this new show on the WB, and it was gonna pick up where the film Buffy the Vampire Slayer had left off. And that was a movie that I had gone to see when it came out, when it had its initial run in the theaters. I liked the concept of it. I thought it was interesting, funny movie. I didn't know what to expect from the TV show because there were a lot of elements in the film that were played for laughs and were really played broadly for laughs, especially Paul Rubens' vampire character, who has maybe the best vampire death scene ever. He just would not go
No.
under. But so I didn't really know what to expect. Kind of tucked it away for a while, And then one night, actually, it was while working out. We had a projector in our basement, a little bit of a screening room, and behind the back curtain was an elliptical trainer, and I got on the elliptical and would put on TV shows. And it turns out that a 42 to 44 minute episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer was about perfect for a workout. And that's what got me sucked into it. Each night I went to work out, I would pop on another episode, and I started getting caught up and sucked in.
Yeah, so similar to you, my first exposure to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV show, had to do with the movie because I had seen the movie. I had a pretty big crush on Christy Swanson, and it's kind of hard not to watch a movie that had Luke Perry in it because it's like, oh, this guy's on 90210. He's kind of hot shit right now, so let's watch this too. Interesting concept, definitely a cult movie now for sure because you don't hear very many people talking about the movie. I was actually talking with some high school kids at my church, and we were talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and a couple of them didn't know it was based on a movie. They just know that it was a TV show. And then the other thing you mentioned, the CW or WB at the time of it. Buffy was one of those shows that kind of amplified the WB, that along with Dawson's Creek for me. I'm a Dawson's Creek seasons 1 through 3-ish apologist, unfortunately, because I did kind of love that show, and then it got weird. But yeah, for sure, the WB around when I was in middle school was just coming into form, and Buffy was arguably probably its biggest hit.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, for a long time, I think it was. It was, like you said, a handful of shows that really carried the network for a while. And then, of course, like you referenced, it became the CW, and Buffy's history with it was kind of interesting as well because the first 5 seasons ran on the WB, and it was uncertain whether it would continue past that 100th episode that ended season 5. And they did go on for 2 more, but they had moved to UPN, the United Paramount Network, which was, in retrospect, a pretty short-lived little network. But they finished out their run with season 7, and what a lot of people regard as one of a handful of sort of perfect series finales that gave everybody something to do. We're getting ahead of ourselves, but it really did end on a high note and kind of ended at the right time, I think.
Nice. Good call with that. So where would you like to start? Do you want to start with a specific character? Do you want to start with, anything like a particular aspect of the show? What is it about Buffy the Vampire Slayer in particular that you love the most?
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that always comes to mind when I think about Buffy is I don't recall a lot of TV at that time or earlier in my life. Okay, so just to put it in context age-wise, Buffy ran when I was, sure I get this right, late 20s, early 30s. So is that right? Yeah, late 20s, early 30s. So I had seen a fair amount of TV prior to that. And what I don't feel like I had seen a lot of was episodic television with a story arc being told over the course of a season. We see a lot more of that now. I mean, a lot of it, but I just don't recall seeing a lot of it back then. And except like soap operas, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And there was a point pretty quickly. I mean, there came a point around season 3, season 4, when, someone would ask me about it and you try to explain it succinctly and you realize you can't because all these interactions are so complicated. And despite what could at times be a sort of monster of the week storytelling, there was always this thread, and the relationships between the characters started to really take on a bit of a melodramatic and soap opera kind of tone. So that longer form storytelling over the course of a season really, for me, was a big draw because I like that. I liked that. And although, we don't have many examples of it now in the streaming age, the fact that it was appointment television and that, on a Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, if I wasn't home or my spouse at the time and I were not at home and one of us had forgotten to set the VCR, there's going to be hell to pay because you had to be there. You had to watch it. It was one of those deals where, it was because you wanted to know what the next thing was. Now, I will say not every episode. I mentioned Monster of the Week. So what Joss Whedon, the creator of the show, wanted to do with the show and what was different about the show from the movie was, built around this idea of what if a cheerleader was the chosen one to fight vampires in a town in California. Sort of like the least likely person to play the Van Helsing role and take out vampires. Wouldn't that be fun? When Joss Whedon sold it to the network as an ongoing TV show, what he started with was, let's start with the premise that high school is hell, and literally put the high school on top of a thing called the Hellmouth, which was a portal to the underworld. And it meant that the entire town of Sunnydale, I was confused Sunnydale and Sunnyvale.
Vale, yeah, I confused that a lot too.
Just weird stuff happened in Sunnydale, right? You had all forms of monsters and demons and, of course, vampires. And over time, you'd get the occasional werewolf and you'd get all these monsters. And especially in the early going, before it became even more episodic, what you would get is each week there'd be a monster that was kind of, sometimes more, sometimes less, a metaphor for something, a metaphor for some aspect of adolescent life that had to be dealt with, either a social situation or, hormones gone wild or whatever it was played out as a thing that needed to be fought off and defeated by the end of the episode. And again, that started to fall off a good bit, once you got into season 3, because so much had happened and the story was just rolling on its own. And the lore of Buffy as the Slayer, the one girl in all the world that, was chosen to fight the vampires, that had been established, and all these other supporting characters. And like I say, you could see the point where it took on a life of its own. Like, it needed to be Monster of the Week for a while until the characters took root, and then it became really character driven. And, you just get sucked into those relationships.
The show that kind of had a similar trajectory with something like that was Smallville, because Smallville did Monster of the Week for a while, particularly that first season, where it was like, okay, I get what we're looking to do. We're trying to establish characters, we're trying to establish relationships, but we need to give them something to do to kind of differentiate between this is a conventional, show about high school versus a show about superheroes in the case of Smallville. And in the case of Buffy, this is about a slayer and killing all of these monsters. So, because I look back at shows during that time frame, the show that comes to mind the most that is, episodic when it comes to Monsters of the Week is something like the X-Files.
Sure. Yeah.
Not a strong through point when it comes to the story, like overall story from a season long standpoint, because you have Mulder and Scully, who obviously they care about each other. They, we see their relationship develop, but that's about it. It's not like we're going to Mulder's, childhood home and talking to his parents or anything like that, or Mulder's or Scully's friend that she goes drinking with after she has to handle, some of these weird things from the X-Files. So I kind of view what the X-Files was, kind of this Monster of the Week exclusively type of thing. And then we move up to Buffy, where, like you said, it kind of blends a little bit more together. And the story kind of eventually starts to speak for itself, where you don't need to rely so heavily on the Monster of the Week. And sometimes it becomes Monster of the Season, even.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. What's interesting about the X-Files comparison to me is that you got hints in the X-Files of what it could have been if the showrunners had taken a similar approach to what Buffy did, because I mean, I forget what song is it. There's a song with a line that says, "I hope the smoking man's in this one." Watching X Files with the lights on, I hope the smoking man's in this one, because anytime the smoking man showed up, it was like, oh, good, this is gonna. Usually, some of the best episodes, usually written by the show's creator, Chris Carpenter, I think. But those were advancing a bigger story, and it was always like, ooh, this is driving the mythology forward. And I guess in some ways, I'm saying that surely not everybody felt that, but I think to me it speaks to, okay, I was getting nibbles in X Files, and I found it as a meal in Buffy, because that is just end to end. I mean, not even just the story within the season, but for the most part, really good continuity to tell a 7-season story.
So the song is "One Week" by Bare Naked Ladies.
Okay.
I just Googled it. That's hilarious to me, mainly because that movie is just, or not movie, song is just ridiculous. But yeah, from a story structure standpoint, like you mentioned that it was a little, it had a lot of iterations. We go from Monster of the Week to season long storylines kind of blending together and everything like that. I'm glad that that's something that, you know, caught your attention. It was something that kind of helped fulfill your TV needs at the time, because, like you said, it was either one or the other a lot of times. And it's really nice to have something that's at least trying out to do both, because now it seems like a lot of TV shows, they do both. And it's, with TV shows nowadays that have less episodes, because Buffy was one of those shows that each season was long. It was long. Those were full, like, 20-ish plus seasons, and at 45 minutes a pop. You don't find that at all anymore. Well, not on streaming services,
Yeah.
and on network shows. There's like usually long breaks in between, whatever. So it breaks things up a little bit, but you just don't see that anymore.
Well, and I would say it's a great point. There were seasons where you felt it. You felt the like, you could just tell. Okay, so I'm going to offer up something as an older person who lived through a time when network sweeps were a thing. So for listeners that aren't familiar with what sweeps weeks were, or sweeps months, I should, what network TV shows would do is there would be, I want to say, 4 months out of the year that they called sweeps months. And for some shows, those were the months where you got new episodes. You didn't get any other months of the year were reruns. So, like September, you'd get 2 to 4 weeks of new episodes. November, you'd get new episodes. February, you'd get new episodes. And May, you'd get season finales, and the run and the lead up to that. So the other thing that happened in sweeps months is you'd have all the really big stuff happen. You'd have stunt casting, you'd have special guest stars and things like that. You didn't get that so much with Buffy, the special guest stars, but every once in a while you'd get what you'd get with Buffy. And I do think it would be worthwhile to pause in a minute here and quickly do just a quick main character rundown before we
Oh
start
yeah, well,
too much about
don't
specifics.
don't you worry. We will
I'm
get to
sure.
that.
So there was a point after the third season of Buffy where one of the major characters, a vampire named Angel, who figures prominently into Buffy, he decided he was going to leave Sunnydale and go to LA and started detective business.
As one does in
It
an
made all the
instance
sense
like
in the
that.
world at the time, believe me.
Mhm.
But when they did that spinoff, the way that aired for the first, what, 2 years, the first 2 years, was that on the WB you would get Buffy at 7 o'clock on Tuesday and Angel at 8 o'clock on Tuesday. And so during a sweeps month, that's when you'd see crossover nights where both Buffy and Angel would be referring, the episodes shown on a given night might be referring to the same story, or Buffy would visit Angel and Angel would visit Buffy. So you'd kind of get the special guest star thing, but it was this deeply interwoven sort of collection of stories that were being told, or maybe a two-part story told across 2 hours, that sort of thing. Go ahead, Mike.
The WB is, or CW now, is an a network that is really good at stuff like that. I think of things like the Arrowverse, for example, that had these
Mm-hmm.
huge scale crossover events and things like that. I cannot recall any other network or any shows sans maybe Flintstones and Jetsons or The Simpsons and The Critic that crossed over in such a way. Like it's easy to cross over when the show's like a natural spin-off
Sure.
of an existing property, but that doesn't change the fact that to have a crossover event like that didn't happen
Yeah.
very often.
Yeah. And actually one of my top Buffy moments came from one of those crossover nights. So when we get there, we can talk about that.
So
Should we
you
do that quick character rundown?
Yeah, let's go through the character rundown. So starting at the very top with Buffy, played by Sarah Michelle Gellar. Then from there we have Nicholas Brendan as Xander, Allison Hannigan as Willow, Anthony Head as Rupert Giles, which is strange to me because he plays Rupert on Ted Lasso,
Oh,
and
sure.
he is
That's probably intentional. I actually had not put that together.
it's
Because they just call him Giles on Buffy all the time.
it's very weird because Giles is kind of like a pseudo parent to them, watching out for them, kind of guiding them. And Rupert and Ted Lasso is kind of a jerk. So it's like it's just weird. Those are your core four. It started with those four, and then eventually it branched off to other people. Other people came in and out of this group, but why don't we talk about
Well,
these? Oh,
let me
go
add a
ahead.
few if I could real quickly. Okay, so
Go ahead.
so real quick descriptions. You got Buffy Summers, right? Like Mike said, she's the Slayer, and there's you learn over time that there's this long line of Slayers, and there are important things you need to know. Like if a Slayer dies, then another one gets called in her place, because in theory, there's only one at a time. All of that stuff gets blown up later, and we'll talk
Yes.
about that. Allison Hannigan's Willow is Buffy's best friend, kind of a nerd, definitely a nerd at the beginning. As time goes on, she starts to develop powers as a witch. So you get that aspect of the supernatural coming in. You've got other characters. Anya is a character who's a vengeance demon. And, Seth Green shows up and is dating Willow. He's a character named Oz, and he's dating Willow for part of season 2 and all of season 3.
Isn't he also a werewolf?
He's a
If I
werewolf.
recall
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
absolutely. He's a werewolf. So, and Giles is a watcher. So, a watcher is over time, Giles takes on that parental role for Buffy. But at the start of it, his role is to just be sort of a coach and guide to her. You've also got then Angel, who I mentioned before. He's a 200-year-old vampire who shows up to warn Buffy that bad things are coming. Eventually, they fall in love. You've got Spike, the vampire. Before there was Twilight, there was, are you Team Angel or Team Spike? I think it was before Twilight. I'm pretty sure.
Way before Twilight, way before Vampire Diaries, way before what's the other one? True Blood. The who is she gonna choose thing? Obviously Buffy's not the first to do it, but at the same time, I would say Buffy arguably did it in the most like commercialized way, where it's like, hey, this is a huge topic of conversation. And as we'll probably talk about, you've got a very strong opinion about which team that you're on in that respect.
Yes, for sure. But yeah, so Angel was really good from the start. Spike shows up as the quote unquote big bad in season 2. And so he has a really interesting arc over the course of the series, going from a primary villain to something else. And I wanted to mention all of those because Xander's an interesting character, and there are ways we can talk about him as we go later too. But Xander is just a dude. He is a human guy with no special powers. He's not a supernatural being. Joss Whedon, the show's creator, did say in some early interviews that the character of Xander was sort of his voice in the show. And if you've seen other Joss Whedon stuff and you think about the way that the smart ass quips are kind of fired off, by different characters, even in the Avengers. I think a lot of that Marvel brand of humor was either just already there and it was a natural fit for Joss Whedon, but I think he added to it.
Yes, very
Yes,
much.
that is the character of Xander. He's the one commenting on this action and wanting to be a part of it, but really at times not knowing where he fits in, at times clearly having insecurities about what's going on around him, and wanting to be sort of this classic male protector and supporter, but also dealing with the fact that he's surrounded by some very powerful women. It's kind of interesting to watch. I don't know that it goes as deep as it could have gone, but I also don't know that Joss Whedon's take on that was necessarily as deep as it could have been.
All right, we've
Are we opening the Joss Whedon box?
Yeah, I think it's time. We've mentioned him a couple of times, and I think first and foremost, I think because Iris and I met for breakfast one day to kind of talk this over, and I think an important point that she brought up is that TV shows and just any type of creative property, there's a lot of people involved in that, and as much as we can't discount the contributions of all the other people who made this show what it was, because I get it for individuals who I refuse to watch anything by Josh Whedon now because of the allegations that he's had about misconduct on set, about intimidation tactics, just a variety of different things that he's now accused of, and he's dare I say effectively like canceled right now, which I kind of cringe at that term, but that's kind of the best way to describe it at this point. And I anybody who feels that way, you're allowed to feel that way. It's not like I'm saying it's like no, you can't. I'm not dictating how you should be feeling about that. However, at the same time, I think one thing that you brought up is that we can't discount the contributions that everybody else made to the show, because it takes a literal village to put on a production like this. And although Josh Whedon was a major part of this, he's the creator, he was the writer. I didn't realize that he was the writer of the TV or of the movie as well. And that's why he was so invested in making this into a little bit more of his vision, because it got Hollywoodized a little too much. And he was like, no, that's not what I had in mind for this. But it still got rave reviews. And then he shepherded it from the movie that was, not that successful at the box office, but now the cult hit that it is now, to the TV show that is, generation defining, arguably, for the CW and just for everything around it. But yeah, so we can't discount that. However, can't discount the fact that Josh Whedon has been accused of a number of things by a number of people on this show, and can't discount that at all.
Yeah, there are a couple of interesting things with that. One of the things I find interesting, and I'm not speculating necessarily on anybody being truthful or not. There are a lot of stories, and when there's that much smoke, you can guess there's fire.
Yeah.
One of the things I find interesting is that only really blew up around Buffy and Justice League. Joss Whedon did other stuff. And I don't recall ever hearing the Firefly cast saying much. I guess the Angel cast, but that was really kind of an extension of the Buffy cast. It's just interesting that there were some casts that commented on it and others that didn't really, at least not that I recall. Bottom line, though, is he is somebody who has been canceled in ways that not many have. I mean, you think about, like, who would have thought that Louis C.K. would come back and Joss Whedon wouldn't? There was a time not so long ago, certainly in 2012, Joss Whedon could write his own ticket after he did Avengers, and then the cracks started to show. Yeah, look, I mean, I have read the things that he's alleged to have done, and it's kind of funny. Sometimes you listen to interviews with somebody enough, and you're like, yeah, you know what, I could see it. I can believe that he had it in him just based on the way he would talk about other. So, like, as an example, yelling at and humiliating writers in the writer's room. Yeah, I can see it. Wanting to run the show and run shooting days longer than what had been agreed upon, to the point that Sarah Michelle Gellar, kind of came forward as a leader among the cast to call him on that and say, hey, we've been at this for 15 hours. It's an hour past when we said we were going to stop. It's time to stop. And the power struggles that ensued with that, other actors that have really, said that he, beyond humiliation, really kind of threatened their careers and everything else. All that said, and I don't want to get into the classic art versus artist argument. I think the "it takes a village" argument is the one that I tend that tends to come to mind for me. For whatever Joss Whedon did, and for whatever ways in which he appears to have been a fairly awful human being, he created some good art here, or some good commercial art in any case, and art that spoke, as you said earlier, Mike, to a generation, and that sucked me in and became a part of that time in my life. So I still look back on it fondly. But it did strike me, just in talking about the skill and creativity that he had, along with all the other bad stuff, that when I came up with my list of 13 favorite moments, I want to say that 10 of them came from episodes that had been written and directed by Joss Whedon. The guy was good at what he did, but the way that he did it, and I mean, the work I do, we talk about this all the time. People who do good things but leave carnage in their wake, you can only do that for so long in any field. And if anything, I'd say it's ultimately a positive that he was called to account for it, and we get the benefit as viewers of still being able to go back and watch the things that he created that sort of outlive whatever his misdeeds have been.
Yeah, Hollywood is unfortunately one of those industries where this has been a problem for a long time, and it's taken a lot of people to have their lives ruined is a strong word, because but for some people it may have ruined perceptions, it may have ruined the time on a show, it may have ruined their careers potentially at that point. And I think the point that you bring up is that I look back at some of the other stuff that Josh Whedon has done. I'm a big Firefly. I'm even one of those people who loves the movie Serenity as well.
Yeah,
For
that's
warts
good
and
stuff.
all, warts and all. I know. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're a fan of the show Dollhouse as well,
Ooh
ish.
boy, ooh boy.
No,
I'll tell
no.
you what, I
Am I-
watched Dollhouse during its run.
Okay.
It is beyond problematic, and it does not have the benefit, in my mind, of having enough to recommend it to get past the Whedonness of it.
Okay.
Yeah, you get, if to whatever extent, and again, these are all allegations, and nobody, everyone's being, some people are being more coy than others about it. And so there's not like some comprehensive understanding of what he actually did.
Yeah.
But boy, Dollhouse really went in some directions that were troubling, because look, I mean, at the time Joss Whedon was making Dollhouse, he had come off of making Buffy, he had made Firefly. He was kind of being viewed, I think, in a lot of ways as the go-to guy for the quote unquote strong female character. And then he made Dollhouse. And Dollhouse, if you got into it, had a couple of those classic Whedon kind of characters, but it dealt with, I don't want to get too into a Dollhouse. I mean, we're not doing a Dollhouse episode, but it dealt with people who signed themselves over to be brainwashed and rented out to people, brainwashed and programmed with an identity and then rented out to clients. Okay, so that right off the bat is kind of, it's centered on Eliza Dushku, who plays Faith in Buffy. And once you got into, again, the mythology, because see, similar to Monster of the Week, like we talked about earlier, there were 2 seasons of Dollhouse. And when you got into all the inner workings of the company that was doing what they were doing, it really took a different direction and started to feel more like things that were good about a Joss Whedon show. But before that, It was, who's Eliza Dushku going to be this week, and who's she going to meet, and what's she going to do? And it was this weird sort of situation of the week. Who's she going to help in some way? Really bizarre at the beginning, and then as it got further on, things got just, I don't know. It was violent towards women in some weird ways. It was inherently problematic, I think, and it's hard to be an apologist for that one.
I'm sorry, I mischaracterized you for that.
At
I
the time,
definitely
at
do.
the time it aired, I was super excited about it. In retrospect, it was really problematic.
So one thing that you mentioned that I've been wanting to get into is this notion of the strong female character
Yep.
that Buffy the Vampire Slayer has. Because if you look back at when the strong female character became a thing, and not unfortunately the kind of joke that it is a little bit now at times. You look back at some of the strong female characters of the time frame. You have like some that I pointed out were Xena, warrior princess. You have, kind of like on the tail end of like the advent of the strong female character was Jessica Alba's character in Dark Angel, and then you also have La Femme Nikita around this time as well, maybe a little even earlier. The key difference between all of those and Buffy, though, is that Buffy is not some warrior. She did not grow up being trained to do this her whole life. She was a high school teenager. I mean,
Mhm.
yeah, if you're in high school, you're a teenager. Yeah, that was a dumb thing to say. Whatever. But it's one of those things where I think the thing that I appreciated it the most about Buffy is that she took on this responsibility and she ran with it.
Yeah.
And all the credit in the world goes to Sarah Michelle Gellar for this because at the time Sarah Michelle Gellar was huge around this time frame because she was in this, she was in Scream 2, she was in I Know What You Did Last Summer. She
Scooby Doo.
was can't forget
Come
about
on,
Scooby Doo.
Scooby Doo. She was Daphne.
Of course.
Speaking of strong female characters, come on.
Obviously can't forget about Daphne from Scooby-Doo. But it's one of those things where when I think of strong female characters from this time frame, I give Buffy a bit of a leg up for not only degree of difficulty but also kind of what it meant to, well, I'm assuming what it meant to a lot of at least high school girls at the time be like, wow, that's really empowering. You didn't see things like that very often,
Yeah,
especially
look,
in the late 90s.
yeah, what I think, I think about the shows you just listed. One of the reasons I think that to some extent people started to sort of puncture the idea of that early 2000s trend in strong female characters is there's another song line. There's a song by an artist named Storm Large called 8 Miles Wide. Explicit content alert. If you're not into it, don't look it up. If you don't mind a really crass song, it's worth a listen. But there's a line where she says, it's cool if she's powerful, but way better if she's cute. That was the through line in a lot of those characters, is they were very, very attractive and they kicked ass. Watching Buffy, going back and rewatching some of the early episodes in season 1, Sarah Michelle Gellar did not know how to kick ass yet. The fight scenes are rough, but they get better over time, and you started to see, the fight choreography improve. But you also mentioned Xena, and what I think Xena had that Buffy had even more of was with Xena and Gabrielle, you had two different ideas of feminine strength playing off each other and in relation to each other and not adversarial towards each other. And so that dynamic, I think, was interesting for a lot of people. I know it was interesting for a lot of people. With Buffy, you have a lot of female characters. And as time goes on, the idea of what makes each of those characters strong at points and weak at points, and that includes Buffy. She goes through some real challenges. There's an episode where she is, at least in her head, it's a little unclear. She's not really in a padded room, but she's basically, working things out in her mind in an episode called The Weight of the World. There's season 6 is really tough for that character. And she goes through some hard times and really kind of descends in a lot of ways into a much darker, series of just personal conflicts. but then she comes out of that and it's a different narrative of strength. Some of the things that I think were interesting, we talked a lot about Joss Whedon, but there were other showrunners, especially in some of the later seasons. Well, season 6, most notably, Marty Noxon, who had been a longtime writer on the show, took over as the showrunner for a season. And if I recall correctly, I think that's the year that Firefly was getting made. So Joss Whedon's attention was diverted to that. Noxon took over. That season 6 is kind of a love-hate season for a lot of people. I think a lot of people love it because it gets more adult. You see Buffy, leaving her attempt at Sunnydale College or UC Sunnydale, I think it is. She leaves college and she has to get a job and she's working in a fast food place and it sucks. And wouldn't it be great if I could make money being the Slayer, but I can't make money being the Slayer. So I have to work during the day and I have to go patrol at night. All of and I mean, and it gets much, much, much deeper than that. She's dealing with some really deep existential stuff that we can talk about in a bit. She's dealing with this romantic situation she's got with Spike. By this time, she and Spike are a thing. And that is a very different type of relationship than what she had with Angel earlier in the series. Again, I bring all this up to say that, there's a lot of characters, a lot about female characters finding their strength, and in some cases losing their strength and then finding it again. And I think that is a big part of what resonated with people and a big reason why those characters from Buffy transcended the trope of the strong female character. Because if all it is, she looks cute and she kicks ass, that's not going to sustain itself over 7 seasons, 7 long seasons, as you said. There was enough story to tell around the character of Buffy and the female characters around her that I think its reputation as a show that told stories about women who were really distinct from each other and distinct from the male characters around them. Let me be clear about one thing. This is not a show that's passing the Bechdel test by a long shot. When I say they're distinct, I would say, generally speaking, despite the fact that there's Team Angel and Team Spike, I don't see Buffy as a character that was defined by the males in her life. I think that she had those relationships, but I think she was very much her own character. And that wasn't something that you always saw then or now. You see it more now than you did then.
That's very true. Yeah. So
should we talk moments? Or do you want to talk about something else?
Before we talk moments, really quick, one thing that I want to ask you, let's kind of wrap up final thoughts. Like, what is going to be for you the lasting legacy that Buffy the Vampire Slayer kind of leaves behind for you?
When I said earlier that I thought the show ended and wrapped up about as well as it could have, season 7 ends with a spell, and I'm just quickly going to give it like an overarch on season 7. What happens is Buffy, over the course of season 7, Buffy and her friends are confronting the first evil, and I'm making air quotes when I say that. The demon that they're dealing with is called the first evil, and it's got the ability to possess people. And these uber vamps come out, and they've got reinforced sternums, and so they can't be stabbed with a stake as easily. And there are just all kinds of ways that they are worse than the usual vampire. And they are coming out of the Hellmouth, and they are ready to take over the world. And it's going to be the 7th apocalypse, because there were 7 seasons. It's the latest apocalypse, and the apocalypse to end all apocalypses. The way throughout all this, Buffy is trying to train what a group called the Potentials. They're potential slayers. So she's training other young women in how to fight like she does. And at the end, basically, Willow, who's full on witch now, she does this spell that takes that power that was given to Buffy as the one slayer and distributes it to everybody. It gets distributed to the Potentials. And there's actually a really cool moment where you see this girl who's maybe like 7 or 8 years old at a softball game, and she's like scared. And all of a sudden she kind of looks up with this grin on her face, like she's just ready to kill it. There were other things like that. So the message is Buffy got her army that she needed, but that power of the Slayer, that strength that we were talking about a minute ago, is available to everybody, not just one chosen one. That message is really cool. I mean, that message, I like that as a message. I think it's the message a lot of people were taking from the show anyways, was this idea of being inspired by what they were seeing, not by the literal aspects of what they were seeing, but again, seeing these characters go through shit and come out the other end and either regain their strength or come out stronger or both. And they kind of took that subtext and made it text at the end of the seventh season with this idea that this power that you've been appreciating for 7 years is available to all of us, and it should be used by all of us, and it should be used anywhere that it's needed. That to me is I like that message. And, when all said and done, Team Spike. I mean, that's the other takeaway. So
for me, the lasting legacy of the show is going to be it made the CW what it is today, in essence. Like, sure, there are shows like Dawson's Creek that came around this time that were still popular, but the CW nowadays is more known for a lot of its supernatural shows. I mean, Jesus, there was a show called Supernatural that was on for like the better part of like
30
15
years,
years.
wasn't it?
It was a long time, but you don't get a show like Supernatural without a show like Buffy the Vampire Slayer that set the table for it before. And I don't want to just relegate Buffy the Vampire Slayer as saying it's like, oh, it ushered in this renaissance of all these supernatural shows, but it also kind of ushered in this new era of just high school shows as well. Because it's not just enough to, yeah, high school's filled with like fun times and things like that. And there were other shows around this time frame that are talking about how much high school sucks, but not in the way that this did as well, to manifest itself in actual creatures in a sense.
Yeah, well, what I think was interesting in that regard is that, and remember, I said earlier, I was late 20s, early 30s watching this. My spouse and I would watch it religiously. When we went to Comic Cons where actors from the show were presenting in panels, you would see the crowd, and the crowd was not a bunch of high schoolers. This had broad appeal, at least from an age perspective, it had broad appeal. One of the things we have not touched on, and I don't know that we have time to go into depth on it, but it wasn't a particularly diverse show. Although it did get a bit better in that regard as time went on. Racial diversity was a problem throughout. There wasn't much. There were a few Black characters. You started to get some queer diversity in the storylines, and we can talk about that when we get into the moments, because one of my moments is, picks that idea up. But it is interesting because you're right. You could call it a high school show, but I think its appeal is broader than that. And I think that's true of the other high school shows that you're alluding to as well. And I think it's interesting. That's just an interesting thing to me. It's because it's a quote unquote high school show. There are a lot of people that may look back at something like that and say, "Oh yeah, that I can relate to high school as hell."
And the last thing that I'll say about Buffy is that it made absolute rock stars out of some of the people in the cast. Like you got Sarah Michelle Gellar in particular kind of benefited from this. From a cast standpoint, not a lot of people blew up as much as she did. You could arguably say the guy who plays Angel, what's his name? David
Boreanaz. Yeah.
Okay, I always mess up his name, and
that's a guy who has not stopped working since that time. He has headlined one show or the other since then, from Bones to he's doing something else now that I want to
like
say is with FBI guys or something.
I think it's a Navy SEAL show, but yeah,
Oh,
he's
that's right.
been consistently working throughout this time, and to get a break from to get his big break from Buffy, that's great, but it's kind of, I always find it kind of interesting when a creator of a show kind of starts to outshine some of the people some of the people in it. Like, so
Mhm.
for example, like one person in particular that comes to mind is Mike Flanagan with all of his shows
No.
Netflix. He's the guy who did shows like Midnight Mass, Midnight Club, and the Haunting on Hill, like some of those shows. He doesn't have the same reputation that somebody like Josh Whedon has, but this had Josh Whedon's fingerprints all over it, and for people to be like, "Oh, that's a Josh Whedon show," I'm like, well, okay, that's all good and well, but like at the same time, it's like, don't forget about all these other people who brought the show to life as well, and between this and Firefly, this kind of brought him up to a stratosphere where he could you know, kind of he didn't approach like blank check type of opportunities where it's just like, yeah, just do this and we'll gladly have you. But it was one of those things where it's like you have these two under your belt, those are pretty good. And then you get a show like Dollhouse as a result of that, that eventually kind of leads into him doing, being the czar that helps brings the Avengers
Yeah.
together. And for better or worse, he's going to be a polarizing figure for a long time, but it's going to be one of those things where it leaves behind a very complicated and very uneven, same as complicated, I guess, but it just leaves a very interesting way that we have to perceive this for someone like him. So, and we've
Yeah,
we've talked
it's
about.
an uneven legacy for sure.
So you're right from a timing standpoint. I know I'd love to talk about all these moments, but I'm going to narrow it down, and you could either speed round through some of these moments, or you could hone in on a couple that are particularly close to your heart.
Sure. So I guess there are three that I'll touch on real quickly. Season 5 is the season of Buffy that to me was the most well constructed end to end. We talked about, individual episodes. Season 5 was the one where as it got closer and closer to the finale, you started to see callbacks to earlier episodes that were just really clever, really well placed. It's where you start to see the first real glimmers of a Buffy Spike romance coming together. It also has an episode called Fool for Love. Let's say it's the seventh or eighth episode of the season, and you get the backstory of Spike. Now, again, he shows up in season 2. He's the bad guy. He's kind of on the fringes in season 3. Season 4, he shows up again, but he's kind of realizing that he might be in love with Buffy. So by season 5, he's actively helping the group. And Fool for Love begins with Buffy getting her ass kicked, basically, by a run of the mill vampire. And she's concerned, and she knows that Spike killed 2 Slayers in his time. So she wants to know how he did it. And you get the story of how he became a vampire, and you get the 2 stories of the 2 Slayers that he killed. And it's heartbreaking. I mean, it's really the 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 story of how this guy named William became Spike, aka William the Bloody, is hard to watch. Side note on that episode, apparently that story has a lot of echoes in the actor James Marster, the actor who plays Spike, James Marster's personal life. And when Joss Whedon presented him with that script, he said something to the effect of, "You bastard, I can't believe you did this to me." Because it was basically a story that, from what I gathered, James Marsters had told to Joss Whedon, and Joss Whedon all of a sudden turned it into a screenplay or a teleplay. But it's really good TV, and it does show some things like the moment where Spike gets his black leather coat. There are things that become callbacks later on when you get to season 7. So that's a great episode. Like I say, season 5 end to end, my favorite. I mentioned queer representation. In season 4, Willow meets a character called Tara, another witch. They begin to slowly fall in love over the course of the season, and Willow comes out as a lesbian. There is a lesbian kiss in an episode, I believe, late in season 4, maybe early in season 5. That was a super big deal at the time. And one of the things that I was reading that Joss Whedon really, first off, he basically said he would leave the show if the network wouldn't let him air that kiss. But he also was very emphatic that he wanted it to just be a part of an episode and not some quote unquote after school special movie of the week kind of thing.
Rather just some like throwaway moment or things like that with no significance or anything like that.
Yes, and actually, I'm sorry, I mentioned it might be early in season 5. It was early in season 5. It was in the episode called "The Body," and it was one where Willow was being consoled by Tara. And what was so important about it was just a tender moment between two people who love each other. And that was a thing that Joss Whedon fought for, was to show it as simply a moment between two people who love each other and not, oh my God, there's going to be a lesbian kiss. So that's one that I look back on and say, yeah, that he, again, for all the stuff he did wrong, he did that right. And then I guess the last one, the last item I'll mention is that seventh season finale, the series finale. It is so good. It brings all the right people back. Again, just kind of wraps things up really nicely. You get a few major character deaths that are pretty tragic, but in the end, Buffy saves the world one more time. And that's what you got Buffy for. So no, and there's so much we could talk about, but to me, those were some standouts. And if you haven't read the article and you want to see the full list of 13, you could debate me, you could fight me. What I would say is that I think my list of 13 have some pretty obvious moments. The show, over the course of its episodes, is peppered with great moments, even great moments in mediocre episodes. But as I looked over my list after I made it, I'm like, oh yeah, a lot of season finales in there, because again, it told those long form stories. And by the time you got to the end of a season, there were payoffs. I'm sorry, let me do one more. I mentioned earlier characters who had strength, lost strength, came back. And I also mentioned Xander being this human guy who didn't have any special powers. Season 6 that I mentioned before features a really dark turn for Willow. She basically becomes addicted to magic. And so it's an addict's journey. And, she relapses, and something causes her to go off the deep end in the last few episodes of that season. The season finale, the end of the season finale, she is ready to destroy the world. Tara gets killed and she completely loses it. She is out for revenge and she wants to tear down the world. And the person that stops her, she defeats Buffy, she defeats Giles, and there's no one to stand in her way. And Xander is the one who comes to her in that moment, because they were friends since kindergarten. And he says, look, if I get it, if you're going to end the world, that's fine, but I'm going to be here with you when you do it. And he brings her back to herself. And so, that's the end of season 6. In season 7, she is on the road to some form of recovery and coming back into herself. But and that was kind of a cool moment and a cool message as well, because it wasn't about the person with the really great powers. It was just about love. And the show's got a lot of those kinds of moments, where love wins. And I think that's another reason that it resonates with a lot of people, certainly why it resonates with me.
So there you go. Iris's mention took the words right out of my mouth. If you have not checked out the article, please do so. It is as much a love letter to Buffy the Vampire Slayer as it is, hey, there's some issues that we got to talk about, and we aren't afraid to talk about it to the best of our abilities. But it's still one of those great shows that definitely leaves a amazing legacy, and you should check it out if you haven't watched it before. So Iris, thank you very much for not only contributing to the article. I say contribute in a way that says like, oh, it's not like you wrote 3/4 of it, because you did. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming on the podcast to talk about Buffy. Really appreciate that.
Thank you for the opportunity. This has been a lot of fun. Anytime somebody gives me free reign to just start babbling about a thing I love, it's a great thing. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Glad to have you on. Kiss, Dr. That's going to do it for this episode of SPDM TV. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to anything and everything wherever you get your podcast. Join us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Blue Sky at SPDM Crew. Check out our website. Check out our website at com. Shout out to High Flyer Creative Studios for making our awesome logo. Greatly appreciate their support. And if you have any creative needs, contact them at highflyercreative.com. Check out the other shows on our network. We've got a lot of great content on there, and I'm really proud of the work that everyone's doing. We've got a ton of different things that you could ask for. So check out the other shows on our network. And if you've got a podcast idea or you're interested in being part of the SPDM crew as a guest or collaborating, email us at gmail.com. Until next time, happy watching, friends.